everybody. And first, I want to thank you for the prayers. I don't know if Don, if you wrote the prayers this week, but I think the prayers have been beautiful. They've been so focused on the theme for the day. It's good to see you again and be with you again this morning. And as Don said, I really appreciate you sticking with this from Monday morning until today. I was thinking this morning, today is like our last class. And I don't know about you, but I remember when I was a kid that we were always so excited once the last day of class came around because we knew the teacher would have something fun in store for us. And we're going to talk about love today, which hopefully that'll be fun, or at least, touch our hearts and lift our spirits a little bit. The theme for the week has been how to be good at being human. And I chose the title for today, Love, the Heart of It All, because I really do think that love is the heart of becoming good at being human. That if we're ever going to be good at being human, we can't avoid love. That love has to be the center of it all. And that's simply because that loving and being loved is what you and I were created to do. God gave us life so that we would love, give love, and receive love. It's the reason for our existence. It's the key to our happiness. Really, the giving and receiving in love is the deepest need that human beings have. We are created from love. We live because we are loved, and we find joy, depth, peace, meaning, and fulfillment in our life in loving and being loved. We need to love if we are to live. Uh, there's no way of getting around that. We need to love if we are to live. Love is our lifeline to God. Love is our lifeline to our deepest selves. Love is our lifeline to the hearts and souls of others. And love is our lifeline to the heart and soul of the world. Love is the language that God speaks, and God spoke that language of love most eloquently in Jesus. Jesus, the Word, the perfect incarnation of God's language of love. For you and I to become good at being human, we must learn to speak that language well. Indeed, I think we must try to become eloquent in God's language of love. So today I want to look at that by focusing on three things. First, to consider why love is everyone's lifetime vocation, why learning to love, the giving and receiving of love, is the foundational calling of our lives. Second, we'll consider what exactly does it mean to love well by focusing on what I call three rules of love. And then third, if we are called to love God, our neighbors, and ourselves, how do we go about doing that? How should the various loves of our life be ordered? So first of all, what does it mean to speak of love as everyone's lifetime vocation? Back in 1981, Pope John Paul II wrote a letter on marriage and family life that was based on the principle that human beings are made for love. As John Paul saw it, loving and being loved was not something that we could opt out of, but rather loving and being loved was the very thing we were given life to achieve. John Paul stressed that we become ourselves in loving and being loved, that we grow more fully to life and become the distinctive persons that God created us to be, the deeper we grow in love. The giving and receiving of love is both an inescapable need and an inescapable responsibility. It's an inescapable need because it's the only way to find life. It's an inescapable responsibility because love is what we owe one another. John Paul said, God inscribed in the humanity of man and woman the vocation, and thus the capacity and responsibility of love and communion. Love is therefore, he said, the fundamental and innate vocation of every human being. That's a good place to start in our thinking about love. I think John Paul is exactly right that God inscribed in the depths of our human nature the capacity and the responsibility of love and communion. Therefore, love is the fundamental and innate vocation of every human being. So I think in a way that's saying that every other calling in our life, every other vocation should help us achieve this fundamental vocation to love. So no matter what other vocation or callings we might have, a good question to ask is by answering that call, does it allow me to fulfill that fundamental vocation to love? If it does, then it's a vocation that fits us. If it doesn't help me grow in love, well, then I have to reconsider it. So to say, as John Paul does, that God inscribed in us the capacity and responsibility of love means that it is written in our nature. It's part of our very being. Nobody can escape the call to love. I can run from it. I can hide from it. I can spend my life living in a way that contradicts it by embracing unloving ways of being and acting. But I can never erase the fact that this is what I'm called to be. I can never change the truth that we live only in loving and being loved. Because love is what we're created to do. Nothing else can fulfill or complete us. Nothing else can satisfy us or bring us to happiness. I think it's interesting sometimes that no matter what a person's history with love has been, it's hard to give up on it. Even if they've been badly hurt by it, they cannot really renounce it because they know that to turn away from love would be to deny something essential for their life. In fact, to turn away from love would be denying their very self. Now, many years ago, I was giving a talk in Chicago, and after the talk, a woman came up to me who was quite agitated, and she told me something I'll never forget. She said, "You know, of all the four-letter words, the four-letter word that I've come to hate and detest the most is the four-letter word love." And she went on to say, she said, well, I asked her, well, why was that? And she said, what I've come to learn is that anytime somebody tells me that they love me, I know they are about to do me harm. And when she said that, it really put a chill through me. Anytime somebody had told her they loved her, from her experience, that meant they were about to do her harm. So what she said she did, she said, I built a wall around my heart. I built a wall around my heart because that way nobody can get in and hurt me. But I think she also knew if she built that wall around her heart, she couldn't get out. In a way, she was saying, can you give me a reason to trust love again? She knew exactly what John Paul II is saying. Even though our history with love might be difficult, might have hurtful memories, we can never escape that call. There was a great writer, a woman writer named Bell Hooks, and she wrote a wonderful little book on love in which Bell Hooks said, everybody wants to know more about love. We want to know what it means to love, what we can do in our everyday lives to love and be loved. We want this so much, Bell Hooks said, that we yearn for love, we seek it, even when we lack hope that it can really be found. That's so true. You know, we yearn for love, we hunger for it, we seek it, even if we're not sure it can really be found. Or as the theologian Vincent Genovese wrote, we cannot be truly happy, because we are created for love, nothing else can fulfill us ultimately. Lacking fulfillment, Genovese said, we cannot truly be happy. In light of our destiny, our only chance for lasting happiness is our persistent willingness to love. Our only chance for lasting happiness is our persistent willingness to love. So, to become good at being human, we have to be willing to love. We know that's not easy. It's not always smooth. It doesn't always go our way. But I think bell hooks and Vincent Genovese have it right. In light of who we are, our only chance for happiness is our persistent willingness to love. Now, why is that? The reason that loving and being loved is our lifetime vocation is that you and I are made in the image of a God who is love. Last Sunday, we celebrated the solemnity of the Trinity. Well, when Christianity speaks of God as Trinity, it means that God is a living community of persons. God is not three separate individuals alienated from one another, that God is a living community of persons who are united together by perfect love. God is a vibrant, intimate partnership of mutual reciprocal love, a communion of love in which each one's love gives life, identity, and joy to the others. God is the eternally perfect back and forth of love, the eternally perfect giving and receiving of love. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the British writer C.S. Lewis. And in a little book that C.S. Lewis wrote, Mere Christianity, he expressed this, I think, really well. C.S. Lewis said, God is not a static thing, not even a person, but a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life, almost a kind of drama. Almost, C.S. Lewis said, if you will not think me irreverent, a kind of dance. I love that image. C.S. Lewis is saying, God is the dance of love. God is the joyous, dynamic dance of the giving and receiving of love. As God's beautiful images, you and I are called to be part of the dance. You and I are called to join that dance, that dynamic, pulsating dance of the giving and receiving of love. So this is why we need to extend ourselves in love. This is why we need to work at love, to work at understanding true intimacy, to work at realizing why we need to nurture and protect the friendships of our life and should never take them for granted. It's why we need to be responsible in our marriages, to be responsible in community life together. It's why we need to risk generosity, to risk vulnerability, to risk the hospitality that opens our life and makes space for another, knowing that when we do so, that may change us in very surprising ways. And it's also why we must always risk forgiveness again and again. We can never give up on love. No matter how hard it is, we can never give up on love because we touch life only when we do love. There's no other way. The only way for you and I to touch life, to engage life, is through the giving and receiving of love. Now, these initial reflections on the human vocation to love tell us two very important things. First, they tell us that in Christianity, the most perfect expression of love is characterized by mutuality leading to communion. That's the kind of love we should strive for. Mutuality, the back and forth of love, the giving and receiving of love that leads to communion. Why? Because what's true for God is true for us. If God is the perfection of mutual reciprocal love, if God is perfect, unbreakable love, then what gives life and joy to God gives life and joy to us. Now, it's important to stress this because sometimes sacrifice is held up as the ideal of love that we should strive for. The reason for that, I think, is quite understandable. Jesus' sacrificial love on the cross has rightly been recognized as the greatest and most perfect act of love. And yet, Jesus did not die for the sake of suffering and sacrifice. Jesus wasn't crucified in order to suffer. Rather, Jesus died to reconcile humanity to God. Jesus died to restore communion between God and ourselves. So the death of Jesus teaches us that even though sacrifice is an indispensable element of love, love cannot survive without sacrifice. But nonetheless, sacrifice is not the purpose or goal of love. We don't love in order to sacrifice. Rather, we sacrifice in order to love. So I think the emphasis has to be switched. Sometimes we can feel that we love in order to sacrifice, as if sacrifice is the whole point of love. Rather, we sacrifice in order to love. Sacrifice heals and restores love when it's damaged. Sacrifice is necessary to sustain love, to keep love alive. So sacrifice is an essential ingredient to love, but it's not why we love. Sacrifice is for the sake of mutuality and communion. Sacrifice is an essential means to mutuality and communion, but it's not the heart of love. Second, these initial reflections on love tell us that even though that God is the source and perfection of love, God's love is meant to continue through us. That's such a beautiful idea to take to heart. Yes, God is the beginning and the perfection of love, but God's love is meant to continue through us. This is the purpose of the church. It's the purpose of the Christian community. But isn't it ultimately the purpose of our lives? You and I are to be people through whom the love of God is made visible and comes more fully to life. God loves the world through us, not apart from us, but through us. We are channels of God's love, instruments of God's love in our everyday lives. So if you think of it, God's love always takes flesh. God's love always comes to life. It came to life in the people of Israel. It came to life in the prophets. It perfectly took flesh and came to life in Jesus. But Jesus did not see the story of God's love ending in him. That's why Jesus called disciples, so that there would be a community who learned from him what it meant to be the living presence of God's love in the world. I really can't think of a more meaningful way to live. If you ever sometimes wrestle with the question, why am I here? What is my purpose? What is the meaning of life? What this is saying, the meaning of life is simple. Allow God's love to live through you. There's not a more beautiful legacy to any person's life than that. And for someone to be able to look at you, at your life, and say he or she really did allow God's love to come to life, to live through them. If you remember on Tuesday when we were talking about story, I said we want to find a story that enables us or enables other people to say about us, that person really lived. Not that they kind of lived, not that they sort of lived. That person really lived. We will really live wholly, richly, and completely when we allow God's love to live through us. Why does that matter? There was a great theologian, a Swiss Protestant theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth. And Karl Barth really pushed this idea that God's love lives through us. In fact, Barth said the only way people will know that God is love is through us. So at one point, Barth wrote, Would the love of God then be revealed? Would I even be able to perceive it and respond to it? Without the ministry of the people of God and its members, would I be loved by God at all, or free to love God in return? That lifts up the beautiful responsibility of love. Without the ministry of the people of God, who fulfill that vocation to be instrument of God's love, would people know that they were loved by God at all? Would they know that they are free to love God in return? So, this brings us to the three rules of love, which is a way of talking about what is going on when we love and are loved. What does loving well look like? What does loving well involve? Each of these three rules of love flows from characteristics of God's love. So, the first rule of love is that love is creative and affirming. Real love is creative and affirming. Now, to understand this, it's important, I think, to reflect on how does love begin? To love something is to find it good. It's a simple expression of love. To love something is to find it good. If I dislike something, I'm not going to love it. If I don't find it good, I'm not going to love it. So to love something is to find it good. But we find something good only because we have first experienced something of its goodness. In other words, love begins in receptivity. I reach out to love something only because I have received something of its goodness. Something of another thing's goodness and beauty touches us, enters into us, is received by us, and becomes part of us. It can be something like a beautiful sunset. The beauty of that sunset enters into us, it touches us, we receive it, it becomes part of us. It can be a piece of music, a beautiful work of art, and certainly it can be another person. Because we are affected by another thing's goodness, we are drawn out of ourselves in response. So to love another person is to recognize and respond to their goodness, but only because we have already been touched by their goodness, only because we've received that person's goodness and it's become part of who we are. Now, why is this creative and affirming? In the most general sense, as I said, to love something is to find it good. But isn't that what God declared about everything at creation? In the book of Genesis, after each day of creation, God said, "It is good." And after the sixth day of creation, God looked at everything and said, "Not only is it good, it's very good." So to love someone is to make that same declaration, that same joyous declaration about them. To love someone is to say to them, "I find you very good." As the philosopher Joseph Pieper said, to love someone is to delight in their existence, to take joy in their existence. We see this beautifully when it happens in the love a parent has for a child. As children, to be loved by your mother or father is to know that they take delight in you. They find you very good. They are telling you it's a joyful thing that you exist. When we love anybody, that's what we say to them. It's good that you exist. It's good that you are in this world. When we love ourselves, and we should, we're able to make that same declaration. We're able to say to ourselves, it's good that I exist. It's good that I am in this world. Whenever we love someone well, isn't that what we're communicating to them through our thoughts, our words, and our actions? To love somebody well is to each day let them know it's good that you exist. Now, that's such a powerful and beautiful thing because when that fails to happen, sometimes people get other messages. Sometimes the messages that we receive from others in something as simple as the way they look at us does not communicate to us, it's good that you exist. It does not let us know that I'm glad you're in the world, but in many ways is saying just the opposite. They let us know they're not so sure it's good that we exist. They're not so sure that it's good that we are in the world. That's why it's so important for us to realize the life-giving power of even ordinary acts of love. To love somebody, even in a simple, small exchange, is to let them know that we are glad that they are. In a Catholic understanding of love, there's a very close connection between God's love and our love. God's love has given us life. You and I love because God wants us to be, and because God delights in our existence. But when we love another person, we help bring them more fully to life. That's why love is so beautifully creative. To love another person is not to make less of them, it's always to make more of them. We make less of them when we're unkind, when we're thoughtless, when we don't take note of them, when we act as if they're not even around. There's all kinds of ways to make less of somebody, but to love somebody is to always make more of them. It's to help bring them more fully to life. So, what I'm saying is, our love is not something completely different from God's love. Catholic theology teaches us that our love actively participates in God's love and even in some way extends it and furthers God's love. So it's not as if we're passive channels of God's love. It's not as if we're funnels and God just pours God's love into us and it passes through us. Rather, we are active, insightful, wonderfully creative agents of God's love. When husbands and wives love one another, when parents accept, affirm, and encourage their children, when friends help and support one another, and members of a community do that for one another, when any of us in all of our interactions with people do our best to love them, not only are we imitating in God's love, but we're helping bringing it to completion. That's a great vocation. Not only are we imitating and participating in God's love, but when we love, we're helping bring that love to completion. The philosopher Joseph Pieper said, when we love someone, we little by little perfect what God's love began, because through love, we help bring that person more fully to life. That's why Pieper said we're not just passive funnels of God's love, but active, insightful agents of God's love in the lives of others. It's absolutely the most meaningful thing we could ever do with our lives. It's absolutely the most meaningful thing we could ever do with our lives. There's no better way to spend our time. When we were kids, especially in the long days of summer, I can remember we probably drove my mother crazy because there were a few days where we didn't go to mom and say, Mom, what can we do? What can I do? We would get bored with all those free days of summer. But as we get older, we should never have to ask that question because the answer is always right in front of us. We can always love. We can always be creative, beautiful agents of God's love. That's why, really, I think as we get older and we look back on our life, I suspect that what we'll regret the most were missed opportunities to love. I suspect that what we will regret the most are all the times that a chance to love another person came our way and we didn't respond. We didn't bother. So we understand a Catholic theology of love when we realize that God's love is not enough for us. God may love us, but God has created us in such a way that we absolutely depend on being loved and prized by others. Sometimes people think that as long as God loves us, everything will be fine. But the truth is, that God wants his love for us to be confirmed in us by the love of another. This is what God wants for us. God does not want God to be all that we have. God wants us to know love from others. And so, from being created from the love of God and continually being loved by God, as important as they are, it's not enough. You and I not only want, but absolutely depend on the confirmation of God's love that comes to us through the love of others. This is why the responsibility to love that God has given us cannot be avoided. Each of us waits for another's love to recognize us, to take note of us, to make us more visible. That's the power of love. To be loved by someone is to be recognized, to be taken note of, to be made more visible. If we never feel that, if we never feel recognized, seen, taken note of, and I think many people don't, after a while, they begin to feel invisible. It's like being in a room with people who you know who don't really want you to be there. You don't feel seen. You feel unseen. You feel invisible. So the power of love answers that deep human need to be recognized, to be taken note of, to be paid attention. A second rule of love is that love is insightfully directed to the true well-being of others. It's what Thomas Aquinas meant when he described love as effectively willing another's good. Love is effectively willing another's good. So it's not just that I want your good, but I know how to do it. I can love you in a way that's effective. To love somebody is to seek their good. To love them is to wish that everything about them will truly be good. Love is the heartfelt commitment to work for and to be faithfully committed to promoting what is best for another person. For the theologian Vincent Genovese, love is the commitment to nurture the beauty and potential of another human being, is to see in them what God has created them to be, and to devote ourselves to drawing what God has created them to be more fully to life. As Genovese puts it, love is the desire and willingness to live creatively in the service of others' fulfillment. I love that sentence. Love is the desire and the willingness to live creatively in the service of others' fulfillment. Doing this well suggests two things. First, loving well is hard work. There's a discipline to love. It's not easy to love somebody consistently. It's not always easy, as Genovese says, to live creatively in the service of others' fulfillment. Love is the ongoing, heartfelt attention of ourselves to the well-being of another. But that's hard. When I used to teach at St. Norbert and we would talk about marriage, I would tell the students, look, I want to push back against any overly romantic or sentimental views of marriage. And I would tell them to get married is really to make a vow to pay attention to another person for the rest of your life. And they would kind of look disappointed. Like, is that all it is? And I said, well, think about it. That's a big deal. To love somebody in a marriage is to make a lifelong commitment to pay attention to them for the rest of your life. Or to put it another way, it's to promise not to become inattentive to their well-being. But isn't that the challenge? Whether we're talking about marriage, family life, community life, friendship, it's so easy to little by little become inattentive to one another's well-being. We don't do it intentionally, I don't think. We don't do it deliberately. We just slip into patterns of inattentiveness. We glide into patterns of inattentiveness because The attentiveness that love asks of us is hard. So real love will be hard. Real love at times will be frustrating and exhausting because real love requires us to devote ourselves to seeking the best for another person, not just occasionally, not just regularly, not just when I feel like doing it or not. But real love means showing up day after day, whether I feel it or not. So, yes, we can say that love is a noun, but sometimes I think it's better to emphasize that love is also a verb. Love is a call to action. Love labors. Love labors. Love labors for the good of another. And that kind of love is hard work because there's no days off from love. There's no days off. God never tells us that we can take a vacation from love, even though we can rest on the Sabbath. That doesn't mean that the Sabbath or any day of the week is a day off from love. Loving well is a full-time job. But second, if love is to achieve the goal of attaining what is good for another person, love has to be insightful and informed. To love somebody well, we must take time to really know them as a singular, unique human being. We must gain some knowledge of who they really are, some knowledge of their soul and spirit, some knowledge of who they are deep inside their being. What are their unique desires and needs? What are their cares and concerns? What are their fears and their struggles, as well as their hopes? What are all the things that make them different from others, as well as different from ourselves? So we don't love well when we love everyone in exactly the same way. We don't love well if we love a person as if they are just anybody. The only way to love somebody well is to have genuine insight into who they are, to have some sense of their otherness. That's why good love requires perception, sensitivity, empathy, insight, and imagination. In more theological language, to love somebody well is seeing what is the unique image of God that they were created to bring to life and helping them do that. The third rule of love is that for love to endure, for love to last, love must be steadfast, patient, and faithful. Love needs staying power. For love to work well, it can't be here one day and gone the next. Love needs staying power. Pope Francis aptly described this third dimension of love when he wrote that the Christian ideal is that love never gives up. I think that's great. The Christian ideal, what we should aspire for, is that love never gives up. We certainly see this in God's love for us. It might be most powerfully revealed in the crucified Jesus. Isn't it true that on the cross, in the crucified Jesus, we see a God whose love for us never gives up? That's a tremendous reassurance. In God, we find a love that never gives up. But if God's love never gives up, neither should our love. If God's love lasts, human love should also last. But again, we know this isn't easy. At some point, every love will be tested. At some point, every love will know difficult moments, times of doubt, stress, and uncertainty. At sometimes, even the best of loves will know sorrow, hurt, and disappointment. Even the best of loves are eventually questioned, shaken, and maybe even broken. At some point, all of us, even in the best situations, have likely reached points where we found ourselves asking, I'm not so sure about this. I'm not so sure about this. It's a common, typical question because love, any story of love is going to have different chapters, There's different seasons of love. So even in the best relationships, even in the most life-giving communities, we can find ourselves sometimes wondering, I'm not so sure about this. This is why love requires the virtue of fidelity. The virtue of fidelity helps us not give up on love too early or too easily, because fidelity helps us realize if I give up on love too quickly, I'll never know its promise. To know the promise of any love, we have to have a history with love. If I give up at the first sign of difficulty, if I make that promise, kind of telling myself, if this gets hard, I'll leave it, then I've already made that decision that I will. The only way for us to know love's promise is through fidelity. Now, there's a wonderful book on marriage, and if you, I would highly recommend this book. I'm kind of smiling because I know Dave Colhart is giving a retreat on marriage this weekend, and I'm thinking now, Dave, I wish I had mentioned this book to you before now. Since this is Friday, it's probably too late to help you. But anyway, the book is by Bridget Burke Revisa and Julie Donovan Massey. They were two colleagues of mine at St. Norbert College, Bridget Burke Revisa and Julie Donovan Massey. And the title of the book is Project Holiness. What Bridget and Julie did, they went around the country and they interviewed a number of married couples. So this is a theology of marriage that is really built from the ground up, not from the top down. It's what they did was shape a theology of marriage by listening to married couples, listening to them talk about their own experience of their marriage. Well, what they discovered through these interviews is that marriage has lasted for these couples, not because they were free from trouble or free from challenges and difficulties, because no love relationship ever is, but rather the marriage has lasted because from the very beginning, they decided that whenever troubles began, they would work things out. They weren't going to have a love that was here today and gone tomorrow. They would work things out. They decided that no matter what might lie ahead, they would weather it. You know, whatever their life together gave them, they would work their way through it. But having made that decision from the start gave them confidence about the future. That, I think, is a beautiful example of a love that is steadfast, patient, and faithful. But sometimes, unfortunately, loves can't last. Sometimes, unfortunately, tragically, it might be important to give up on love. There's limit to what we can rightly expect of anybody to persevere with in love. Pope Francis touched on this in his encyclical, The Joy of Love. Pope Francis wrote, being patient does not mean letting ourselves be constantly mistreated, tolerating physical aggression, or allowing people to use us. It's important to say that. Real love does not mean tolerating everything. There's limits to what any love could endure. A sad example of this is several years ago, I was giving a talk, and afterwards, a woman came up to me and she told me that recently her husband had died. And I consoled her and I said, I'm so sorry to hear that. And she said, no, you don't understand. It was the happiest day of my life. And I said, why? And she said, because who my husband was on the outside to everyone else was very different from who he was to me. To everyone else on the outside, he was friendly, outgoing, supportive, the most likable person of all. But within their marriage, for many, many years, he was not that way to his wife. He ridiculed her, he put her down, he diminished her, he hurt her. And I remember thinking I was so sad that she waited for that relationship to end when he died. If our fundamental moral obligation, as I said the other day, is to choose life over death, that holds for every situation in which we find ourselves. When it's clear, abundantly clear, that a relationship has become more death in life than life, when it's clear, abundantly clear, that a relationship has become harmful, morally, spiritually, emotionally, and even physically, to choose over life, death over life each day means that we have to find life. We have to end something that is harming us. So this brings us to one of the most challenging of Jesus's teachings on love, where Jesus says we have to love all of our neighbors, even the neighbors that bear the name of enemy. So is that really possible? And if it is it wise to even try? In calling us to love our enemies, is Jesus asking us to aspire for our love to a love that might actually be harmful? Well, the first thing, I think we just have to be honest enough and admit that there's no wiggling out of the fact that Jesus says there's no exceptions to the command to love our neighbors. Christians are summoned to love all of our neighbors, even those who are most consistently opposed to us. Because Jesus challenges us, he calls us to practice a love that never excludes. Following Jesus demands committing to a love that never gives up on anyone, even those who have turned completely against us. So how should we understand this command? What does it mean to love an enemy? To never give up on an enemy? Obviously, it does not mean that we love someone because they are our enemy or because they are making our life difficult. To love our enemy does not mean that we love them because they are opposed to us in every way. That would mean loving someone because they are hostile and hurtful toward us, because they are opposed to our well-being and may be actively working against it. Rather, to love our enemy is to remember that they are human like us. It is to remember that they too have dignity as a child of God, a dignity that we are called to acknowledge and respect, even when it is hard to see, and maybe even when they don't see it yet in themselves. To love an enemy is to remember that they, like us, are loved and befriended by God. So to love them is to pray that they will claim their true identity as a child of God. To love them is to pray that they will claim their true identity as someone who has been befriended by God, and to begin to live out of that identity. When Aquinas was talking about love of enemies as being an essential component of a life of charity, Aquinas said we must have what he called an interior love for enemies in our hearts. Now, the reason for that, Aquinas said, we need to love our enemies from our hearts, because otherwise, love can be replaced by a vindictive and hateful spirit. The danger of not loving our enemy, or the cost of not loving our enemy, is that after a while, we become them. After a while, if I develop, instead of love, a kind of hateful, vindictive, spiteful spirit to my enemy, then my enemy has succeeded in making me like them. I have become their enemy as they are my enemy. So for Aquinas, we should not hate our enemies. What we should hate is the fact that they are our enemies. That's a big difference. I shouldn't hate my enemy. What I should hate, what I should grieve, what I should mourn is that they are my enemy. Because in being my enemy, that's a missed opportunity for them to love. In addition to that love in our hearts, Aquinas said loving our enemies means we must be prepared to show love for them. We must look for occasions to do so, whether it's expressed in acts of kindness, generosity, thoughtfulness, or understanding, because by actively loving our enemies, we begin to see our enemies differently. And we give them an invitation to begin to see us differently. So I think Aquinas' point that loving our enemies is pointless and as difficult as it can sometimes seem opens up possibilities for reconciliation and peace. They may never come, but at least to love our enemy is to open up a possibility for reconciliation and peace. So this brings us to the third section, loving God, loving ourselves, and loving others. How does it all work out? Jesus tells us to love all of our neighbors, but how do we do that when we're finite creatures who live in particular places and particular times? This question of loving God, loving ourselves, and loving our neighbors stands behind Catholic theology's emphasis on what is called the order of love or the order of charity. Now, these were concepts that most Catholics had never heard of until a few months ago, thanks to J.D. Vance. Suddenly, most every Catholic became quickly familiar with this idea of the order of love or the order of charity. J.D. Vance used that to explain why it was okay to consistently favor those closest to us, including Americans, over the needs of others who are far removed from us, over the needs of migrants, refugees, and the poor of the world. Well, not surprisingly, Pope Francis responded immediately to tell J.D. Vance, you got it wrong. You're presenting a distorted understanding of the order of love. So what does this really mean? How should we think about it? The order of love begins with the assumption that we ought to love God most of all. And when we do, we will know rightly how to love everything else in our lives. So begin with love of God. If we love God most of all, that helps us understand how to rightly love everything else in our lives. You know, Augustine was famous for saying, love and do what you will. What he really meant was love God and do what you will. If you love God most of all, you can do what you will, because you will know how rightly to love everything else in your life. So in the order of love, God comes first. We should love God most of all, Thomas Aquinas said, because something is lovable in proportion to its goodness. We love something because it's good. So Aquinas is saying the greater the goodness, the more perfect the goodness, the more lovable something is. So why should we love God most of all? Because God is the greatest and most perfect good. God is the most beautiful good. So because God is more lovable than anything else, because God is the greatest goodness, God comes first in the order of love. So that's why, even though it's perfectly fine to love other things and perfectly necessary to love other things, whether it's another person, a community, a friend, our favorite sports team, our favorite food, no matter what it might be, all of those things are perfectly fine as long as God remains the center of our lives. That's the trick. If God is in the center, we'll know how to love everything else well. If God is not in the center, if something else is, no matter how good it is, even if it's another person, our priorities will be mixed up. If God is in the center, we'll love everything else the way it needs to be loved. Now, most people assume that in the order of love, if God comes first, our neighbor must come second. We tend to think that self-love must always come last, as if we love everybody else, and then if we have a little love left over, we can love ourselves. But it's interesting that Catholic theology says that after God, we should love ourselves next. Love of self comes before love of others. Now, that's not telling us to always put ourselves the center of attention, and it's certainly not saying it's okay to love ourselves and nobody else. It's not legitimating selfishness. But Aquinas said, if you think about it, we cannot help but to love ourselves before we love our neighbors, because God created us to care about our own fullness and completion. God created us to seek our own fullness and completion. It's our human nature to want our good. And that's why I should never be indifferent to my good. We should never be indifferent to our well being. It's our human nature to care for our good. So, in this respect, self love is wired into us. We're created with a deep and natural inclination to our good, to our own happiness. So, to love ourselves is just another way of saying that we should care about ourselves. We should value ourselves. We should be glad that we are. But another reason that love of self comes before love of others, Thomas says, is simply because nobody is as close to us as we are to ourselves. Our love for anybody else flows out of ourselves. Nobody is as close to us as we are to ourselves. I think what Thomas Aquinas was saying there is that it's hard to love somebody else well if we're convinced that we are unlovable. We have to love ourselves first. It's awfully hard to love anybody else well if you are convinced that you are unlovable. It's hard to let anybody else know that you are glad that they are if you cannot say about yourself, I am glad that I am. That's what it means to say self-love comes before self of others, love of others. Our love for another person flows out of the love we have ourselves. So to love anybody well, we have to love ourselves well. Now, obviously, we love ourselves well, oftentimes, I think usually through the love we receive from others. But that's why anybody who has really little regard for themselves is not going to love another person well. So that brings us then to what does it mean to love our neighbors? Jesus calls us to love all of our neighbors, but we cannot be equally responsible for everybody. And we are naturally more closely connected to some rather than others. Some of those connections are biological. All things considered, Aquinas said, we should love our parents more than we love other adults their age, not only because they gave us life, but they raised us and cared for us. And we should love our sisters and brothers, maybe more than other people their age, because we're part of a family. There's ties of affection there, not just biological connections, but ties of affection. Similarly, we have obligations to friends that we don't have to everyone else because of the affection that we have for them, because of the bond that friendship creates, and because of the history of the friendship. To enter a friendship is to let another person know you will be available to them in ways that you cannot be available to others. So they have a right to expect your presence, to expect your availability. So what I'm getting at is that Catholic theology is saying that our lives are made up of special relationships, such as family, friendships, and our communities. Our lives are embedded in special relationships in certain communities. And we are more indebted to some people than we are to others. When it comes to family and friends, there are more reasons to love them because there's more reasons normally to be indebted to them. There's more reasons to love them because I have more reasons to be grateful to them. So I think this is very realistic, really down to earth. Catholic theology is simply reflecting that some relationships have a stronger moral pull on us, not an absolute moral pull, but some relationships have a stronger moral pull on us. But it doesn't mean if love begins there, it doesn't mean love should stop there. And I think that's where Pope Francis was responding to J.D. Vance. Our lives are made up of circles of love. Our lives are made up of spheres of love. We learn what it means to love in circles of love, such as friendship and family. So ordinarily, our love begins there. Love has to start somewhere. Ordinarily, it begins in families, communities, and friendships. But even though love begins there, love is never meant to stop there. In the gospel, Jesus commands us to love all of our neighbors, not just the neighbors we like, not just the neighbors we prefer or feel comfortable with. So Jesus is challenging us always to expand the circle of love, always to push the boundaries of love, always to push the horizons of love in our life. Because otherwise, if we live simply with what I would call a kind of safe neighbor love, or safe neighbor love for a few quickly becomes indifference for the many. I think that's the challenge of Pope Francis. Our love may begin with family and friends, but if it never grows beyond that, our safe neighbor love, those closest to us, easily becomes indifference for others. Now, I want to conclude this morning by extending this love of neighbor to the whole of creation. If we are called to love and to value all that God loves and values, then this goes beyond simply other human beings to include other species, other creatures, and the whole of creation. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical on care for our common home, Pope Francis says, all living things are intrinsically valuable. All living things matter. All living things have moral status because God loves them and made them. Pope Francis is reminding us that we are not the only creatures that matter. Other creatures matter, and therefore we are called to love them. Other creatures matter, and so you and I have responsibilities toward creation. So if we ask that question, who is my neighbor? Today we have to expand it and say it's not just other human beings, but our neighbor involves all creatures in every part of the natural world. So what would it mean to love our neighbors when we are talking about other species and other creatures? What would it mean to effectively will the good of all creation? At the very least, it would require renouncing the excesses of consumerism and embracing a lifestyle marked by simplicity, frugality, and restraint. At the very least, ecological love of neighbor would also demand that there are times when human interest and human needs must yield for the sake of other species. This is nothing more than extending the principle of self-sacrifice, which is part of any real love, to the love that we owe other creatures. Sacrifice is part of any real love. Sometimes human beings are called to sacrifice for the well-being of other creatures. Then finally, ecological love of neighbor would also challenge us not to have exaggerated confidence in technology when it comes to using that technology to intervene in the natural world. This means acknowledging that sometimes we don't know what the consequences of our actions might be on the environment. It means sometimes we don't have a clear sense at all of the unforeseen long-term consequences of our behavior. So ecological love of neighbor calls for humility. It cautions us to go slowly, to use restraint. More than anything, ecological love of neighbor demands that we cultivate a moral and spiritual vision of reverence. Catholics talk a lot about reverence for life, but in Laudato Si, Pope Francis is saying we're called to have reverence for all life. So really this week, as we talked about becoming good at being human, I think it all comes down to this. God is love, and we should be as well. God is love, and we should be too. Uh, More than anything, I think that's what I've tried to thread through each of the themes for the week, whether we're talking about what is a life of happiness, what is a story worth the gift of our life, or any of the virtues. It all gets down to the point that God is love, and we should be too. So again, thank you so much for